fake news. It is all over social media right now, and it's a hot button issue, at least for the time being, that I felt compelled to discuss at some length because having read a lot of commentary on Facebook, not just today but over the last several months, and also read a lot of literature over the last couple of years. With my major being English, my job being concerned primarily with representation, argumentation, how we take something that happens in real life and then represent it for others to read, after the event. That's a really big issue for me. So I felt like I needed to make a video about it because I think cumulatively, as an American culture, and I would wager, though I don't have any statistical data to back it up, but I would wager globally, cumulatively, we don't understand what the idea of fake news is very well. And you'll see a lot of pieces. At least I've seen a lot of pieces, whether it's video or articles about how fake news is something new, right? Fake news is something you look at tabloids like Weekly World News or other things you'll see on the shelf, as you walk through your grocery store checkout line, that have these stories that are completely divorced from reality. Bat Boy found in cave. I think that's the staple one from Weekly World News. And so it's a lot of people have established that it's something that's been around. But the new argument is that with the advent of social media, we have a completely new kind of fake news that's a lot harder to decipher from the fake news of the past, because the fake news of now, our current fake news, is often laced in with other news. For instance, in native advertising, where you'll read, even on a reputable news source, their website, and we'll get into what reputable means a little later, but in a reputable news source, at the very bottom, you'll see a bunch of links to other articles. Some might be, more links on the site, and then others will be these completely different news sources that, that'll just have these insane looking, thumbnails and weird titles, you won't believe this, blah, 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 or any of these type of really sensational ideas that actually never happen. But it's a little concerning right now because fake news became, I think the sense was, after Donald Trump became elected, a lot of people who identify, and I say people who identify because I hate the terms conservative and liberal and Democrat and Republican, the most divisive terms there are. And I know there's, in some ways, there's no way around using them. You have to, call things, ideas, people, whatever, by things that you associate with them. But I digress. So that a lot of people who identify as liberals are tried to account for reasons why their candidate, who they perceived as kind of a landslide victor, lost. And I think fake news was one of the reasons. In some ways, I think it's a scapegoat, because I think fake news has been influencing political opinions long before this election. And I think it's a greater problem. It's not just, it's a problem because so and so lost. It's a greater problem because fake news warps people's ideas of reality in ways that have no business being there, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they're on, and that's a big deal. But it became a hot button issue because of that fact, and I will openly state I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, not because I identify particularly as a staunch Democrat or anti-Republican or anything like that, but I don't appreciate the manner in which he talks to other people, the manner in which he disenfranchises people who don't have a voice, the manner in which he finds the angriest voice in the room and somehow amplifies it. I'm not a big fan of that, but he does this thing that's I guess you could call it brilliant, but it's something that kids do quite frequently, when they take whatever the criticism is and they reflect it back, right? So people want to delegitimize Trump by saying, there's a lot of fake news out there bashing Hillary, or there's blah, 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 blah. And Donald Trump's response then is to start saying fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news. And that's a little bit of a problem in my mind. And to be fair, Donald Trump's not the only one. By far not the only one who does it, because everyone on Facebook seems to be doing it right now, too. I think people in general just have a hard time identifying what fake news is. And I think it starts to happen when people, see something, for instance, an opinion piece. And they'll say, there's no support for that. That's just an opinion. That's fake news. Or they'll see an article that definitely has some bias to it. There's a little bit of a skew towards one side of the political spectrum or the other. But they'll say something along the lines of, well, that's constructing this piece is might be constructing or trying to attempt to get its readers or its viewers to assume a false narrative, right? So they see false narrative, they see fake news, right? That's the equation. But my argument of that fake news is something very, very different. Fake news might not even be the most specific term that we can use to categorize it, because it's really a lot more complex, at least when we think of what is fake and what is real, right? And I think one of the things that another big issue that people talk about is the end of truth, or the an era of truthlessness, right? Where it's just impossible to decipher what is true. And as a linguist, and I hardly consider myself a linguist, but enough so for the purposes of this video, but certainly as someone who studies rhetoric, who studies language, and who studies argumentation, that there are tools that we have at our disposal to determine, what reality is, even, at least get some sense of it. And it's all rooted a little bit in literary theory. So bear with me for a second. So the theory aspect of this whole thing is it's kind of rooted in the idea of deconstruction. That's kind of where we're at, in the ideas of Derrida, and it all comes to this idea of signifiers. So words, representation, the representative element that we use are signifiers. And so if you look at this diagram that I have here, we're going to use a term that I particularly find problematic, because I think it'll help illustrate the problem a little bit better. So if you see a word like conservative, right? Conservative is a weighted word, heavily weighted word, and so the objective, what you see is conservative. In any individual's mind, it could conjure these images, that which is signified, so what is signified. And you might see, something political, where it's someone's political opinion. You might see maybe you are conserving water. You are a conservative consumer of the environment, or maybe you're very fiscally conservative. You're frugal. All of those different terms might pop into your head. When you see this signifier, these are the things that might pop up. So when you see the word fake news, or the term fake news, these are things that might be associated with fake news, where you have the weekly world news, you have these stories that pop up on your web browser, whether it's Facebook or whatever. You see this Donald Trump. This one drove me crazy all year, because it was this narrative that a lot of people used to disenfranchise Republicans and make anybody who looks like, or who supports anything that Donald Trump does, look gullible or stupid. And the irony is, of course, that it was fake, and so the biases were so strong that they even dismissed. It was a perfect illustration of just dismissing the reality to push the narrative. And I think that's the problem. It's funny, because it's the problem that I have with the term fake news kind of encompasses the whole of the idea of representation, or especially as it relates to fake news. So while the problem right now is that, so there are these parameters of fake news, right? Fake news is something that is completely fabricated, that is used to usually incite, emotion or push a narrative at this point, with false allegations of blah 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 blah. There was one of Hillary Clinton prostituting out people, just absurd things, right? But where the story and the facts and the quotations are completely manufactured. There are things, there are not. Maybe the characters are grounded in reality, but the actual narrative, the story, the stuff that we're supposed to make meaning of, signified, right, are completely false. And that's a far cry from, I had a discussion with someone on Facebook not too long ago about a PBS story that talked about how it was kind of a piece of warning, right, about how teenagers have a harder time, or have a very hard time, deciphering real news from fake news. And there was a comment under, my friend who had posted this picture that said, well, the authors of this piece don't talk about, or they say that here are the problems with these people, but they make them see, they don't present any data that would show that millennials, I think was the word that he or she used, that millennials have any better, or that have a harder time processing and deciphering than people who are older than them. So this could construct a false narrative, and so therefore this itself is fake news. And that starts to teeter a line for me, because there's a difference between my opinion is that this is that, and there was tons of data in the piece too that supported, hey, like, teenagers really struggle with this, and I'll try to find the piece and link it in the description. But okay, there were some words that definitely lended themselves to a skew to say but I think it was more they were more techniques to help the reader, so the audience, that they were targeting an audience, and they were using it to get them to identify with this group of people. But there was definitely some bias. But I think it was a far cry from being just fake news. I think fake news to me is super unacceptable, and where bias, I think, is to be discouraged. It is really, in my mind, it's inextricably bound to the content, because while you can be as completely objective as possible, you're always going to have a little bit of bias, because your personal bias is you shape your bias around how you see the world and how you interpret things. It's all about interpretation, and so I think some people have a better sense of stepping back and understanding things in an objective sense than others. There's no way to escape bias on some level. So to call anything that has bias, any kind of personal bias, fake news, to me that's where I start seeing these issues on Facebook and amongst people, where they start, and I've seen it over and over again, where it's like, well, CNN's fake news and Fox News is fake news, and it's all fake news anyway. It's fake, right? End of truth. That's what it comes down to. But to me, we have tools. We have critical thinking, right? We have rhetoric. We have ways of fact checking, and even there are a couple sources, or several sources online. Snopes is a good one to check for the validity of some of the things that you see. The Washington Post actually just not long ago released a Twitter handle that contextualizes Trump tweets. So they either points out, they either fills in context, or says echoes something else that he says, or just completely says this isn't true at all. But we have legitimate news sources that are really, really trying to police the fakeness of news. So just to kind of nonchalantly condemn something as fake news because it has a political sway is a little scary, to be honest, because that marks, to me, the end of truth. It marks the end of conversation and discourse. And it's an idea where people begin to think, is there an objective reality? Is there any kind of objective truth? And while those issues are very complex, I think using critical thinking skills to come up with those answers is really the key. And once we start using critical thinking to talk about issues, once we start deciphering what is bias and what is fake news, then we can really start having discussions about what the biases are, or how we might interpret biases another way, or starting to use specific language to talk about issues rather than just kind of spinning in this woeful circle of, well, this is fake, this is fake, this is fake. And it doesn't help. And I will say this. It doesn't help when the president-elect of the United States calls one of the most reputable news sources with a liberal bias, whichever way you want to swing it. But one of the most reputable news sources in CNN, fake news, just in a news conference calls it fake news. Like, that's the kind of destructive verbiage that he's used, and it is destructive because now that's something that's a crutch that people can use with an authoritative voice behind it, as ad hominem of a fallacy as that is, or not ad hominem, but an appeal to authority. But as much of an appeal to authority as it is, it enfranchises people who want to dismiss real news because the president-elect said it. So it's a barrier that we need to get past. And so the video's already ran longer than I want, but I need to talk a little bit about fake news today because I feel like we are kind of spinning our wheels right now, and there are much more, there are deeper levels of conversation that we need to get to than just, is this news fake or not? And starting to use that precise language and, deciphering fake news from bias or opinion or even manipulated news. I think even manipulated news, it probably teeters the line, but is different than just straight up fake news. So let's be more careful when we talk about fake news.